That's absurd. That's a worldview that we should shun and reject and move away from. We need to pass this. We need to pass this urgently, and I urge an aye vote, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Michigan reserves the balance of his time. What purpose does the gentleman from Michigan rise?
I now yield 4 minutes to another distinguished member of our committee, Mr. Neal of Massachusetts.
Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized for 4 minutes.
Ask permission to address the House and revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, so ordered.
I don't know, in quick reference to the previous speaker, how you can say, how do we get out of this, and then simultaneously embrace the Romney tax plan, which is $5 trillion more of tax cuts, and propose at the same time the extension of the Bush tax cuts. That's a $7 trillion tax cut proposal. Has anybody heard about those million new veterans we have? The 45,000 that have been wounded? What's going to happen to the veterans system for years to come? A $4 trillion cost of the war in Iraq when you factor all of that together? Now, we had some really good hearings this year on both sides. We talked fundamentally about the best path forward to tax reform, and we all agree that the current system is creaking of its own weight. But that's contrary to the idea of fast-tracking what needs to be a deliberative procedure for understanding what the elimination of some of these expenditures really means. Now, despite the talk here today, I'll bet you this, a year from now, we will not have eliminated the homeowner deduction. And a year from now, we will not have eliminated employer-based health insurance. And we will not have eliminated the tax expenditure for charitable deductions. So the question is, what's the framework that we're taking up today? And the response to that is not much. Now, let me start by saying that what's striking about this proposal is that we all acknowledge that over $6 billion a year, 6 billion hours a year and $160 billion is too much in trying to comply with the current system. My favorite target is the alternative minimum tax. I proposed eliminating that tax for a decade and actually come up with pay-fors for addressing it by shutting down some of the offshoring accounts that currently companies who decide to expatriate and give up their American address take advantage of. They are not former citizens of the United States. They are current citizens of the United States, and sophisticated tax avoidance should be addressed. AMT. It was enacted in response to, and by the way, there were only 2 Republicans in Congress who voted against it. It was a bipartisan assault on AMT when first addressed. 155 high-income individuals weren't paying any taxes. So Congress responded, and President Reagan also embraced the idea that people ought to pay something. Today, 30 million middle-class families are caught in alternative minimum tax, and we patch it each year. Now, here's where the American people really should get upset. Since 2001, this is what the patch has meant. I want you to listen to this number. We have spent $400 billion patching alternative minimum tax. The Romney proposal, coupled with the Republican proposal to extend the Bush tax cuts, will take us in 2012 and 2013, when surely we're going to patch this again, to $600 billion of patches for a $1.2 trillion problem. So we've spent $50 billion of patching it. You know what that's like? That's like taking a credit card and saying that I'm only going to make the minimum payment every month and trying to figure out why the principal has not been reduced.
Gentleman's
the point
recognized for
here is
minute.
that if we all agree that tax reform needs to take place, and we need to assess what current expenditures mean in the system, but also have some enthusiasm for taking up the offshoring issue and taking up those that willfully hide money overseas in bank accounts and they don't want the IRS to know what they've set aside. That's part of fundamental tax reform. There's an opportunity here to do something similar to what Ronald Reagan and Speaker O'Neill did in 1986 in a bipartisan fashion, with both sides getting together in an effort to figure out what to do about building a tax system that keeps America, as the former Speaker noted, competitive going forward. This is not the procedure, Mr. Speaker, to undertake that sort of initiative.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Michigan reserves the balance of his time. What purpose does the gentleman from Michigan rise?
At this time, Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentleman from Virginia, the Majority Leader of the House.
Gentleman from Virginia is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Speaker. Thank the gentleman from Michigan. Mr. Speaker, the choice before us is very clear. The priority for all of us is jobs. And the choice of how to best create an environment to create jobs is, are we going to have taxes go up or not? Now, Mr. Speaker, the House Republicans have put forward solutions to stop the tax hike so that we can help create jobs for small businesses and beyond. Given that economic growth has stalled under President Obama's policies, it is downright puzzling that he and our colleagues on the other side of the aisle would push for raising taxes on working families and small business owners. Nearly 2 years ago, President Obama opposed the same small business tax hike he now supports. Back then, he acknowledged that raising taxes was the wrong thing to do if you want to bring about job creation in a tough economy. This raises the question, does the President actually think that the economy is doing so well that we should now tax job creators? Now, our Democratic colleagues offered their own tax proposal. Instead of offering a plan that would spur economic growth, the minority put forward the President's small business tax hike. But as we saw, Mr. Speaker, the only plan with bipartisan support that passed this House this week was the plan to ensure that taxes do not go up on any American. As many on both sides of the aisle have made clear, the last thing small businesses need right now is a tax hike. There's no mystery as to how small business owners will respond when faced with the higher taxes from Washington. They're rational actors, Mr. Speaker, and when something costs more, you get less of it. With less money to the bottom line, small businesses won't be able to grow as much, and they will not be able to expand as easily. Now, as was said before by my colleague from Michigan and Illinois, I think all of us agree on both sides of the aisle and on both sides of the Capitol. We need tax reform. Now, this bill before us paves the way for the pro-growth tax reform. This measure puts us on a path toward a simpler, flatter, fairer tax code. If you support comprehensive tax reform that will spur economic growth and make this country more competitive, you'll vote for the bill. It's that simple. Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the gentleman from Michigan and his leadership this week and many others in his shepherding the movement for tax reform in this body. And ultimately, today's vote on his bill should be the easiest vote we take all year. Do we believe small business owners are the backbone of our economy? Do we want them to grow their businesses and create jobs? If the answer is yes, then you will support this bill, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back, and the gentleman from Michigan reserves the balance of his time. What purpose does the gentleman from Michigan rise?
I yield myself 30 seconds.
Gentleman's recognized for the 30
The
seconds.
Majority Leader continues to use a tool of propaganda, grabbing small business as his mantra. I want to repeat a fact given to us by Joint Tax. Under our bill, 97% of small businesses would keep all of their tax cuts. 97%. I now yield 4 minutes to the gentleman from Texas, a member of our committee, Mr. Doggett.
This is recognized for 4 minutes.
Reviewing this Republican resolution before us, I found much in its findings and purposes with which I fully agree. The tax code is unfair. The tax code violates fundamental principles of equal justice. Exclusions, deductions, credits, and special rules make up tax expenditures that amount to over $1 trillion per year. And then I reflected on who has been in charge of this tax code for 14 of the last 18 years. And it is the very people who offer us this resolution today. And of the other 4 years, 2 of those, President Bush was in charge of our country. So they've had ample opportunity to correct these deficiencies in our tax code, but the problem is that rarely over the course of the last couple of decades have they met a lobbyist peddling a loophole that they could say no to. They talked to us about a fast track. Well, that would indeed be a new track for them, because they've had almost 2 decades to put in place a tax code that would resolve the problems of which they complain today, and they've been inactive through that period. Oh yes, there was a time when Republicans controlled essentially all 3 branches of the American government, and they flirted with a flat tax. It had great appeal to the Flat Earth Society that dominates the Republican caucus on most issues, but they couldn't make it work. And then they said they wanted a fair tax. And a fair tax sounded like something all of us could be for. The only problem was it was going to hack the cost of just about everything we buy, from food to a car to a home, by over 20%. And when you really get into the details, it wasn't all that fair, except to those at the top who benefited so much from the code that we have. And so Republicans have been in charge now for another 1.5 years in this Congress. They've had an opportunity to come forward not with a pathway to something they would do after the election, but with a specific plan of how they would reform our tax code. And instead of that specific plan for this tax code that has grown by hundreds, if not thousands, of pages under Republican rule of complexity and exception for those lobbyists who are powerful enough to have their voice heard and acted upon in this Capitol. Instead, they come forward this flimsy little resolution of principles with whom most Americans could agree with all of them. It's just the action that counts. And they say, we want to go on a fast track, but we'd rather wait until after the election to start the track. Well, haven't we heard that story before when they were talking fair, when they were talking flat? Today they're just talking about what they might do in the future. And so we have to look for clues within this flimsy little resolution of what, in fact, they would do if they were in authority with President Romney, heaven forbid. And we got clue number 1 yesterday, when they said what they wanted was to extend all of the tax breaks that President Bush approved for the very most privileged people in our society. And the effect of what they proposed and the approach they took was that those who were sitting comfortably atop the economic ladder, they would gain. If they were a millionaire, they'd gain by more in their tax break than a police officer or a nurse or a small business owner in San Marcos or Schertz or New Braunfels or Lockhart, more than they make in a whole year. These people would get in a tax break. Do you have another couple minutes?
I yield an additional 2 minutes to the eloquent gentleman.
Gentleman's recognized for 2 minutes.
But the Marine corporal, the single mom who's trying to get her daughter or son through college, they would actually see their taxes go up under this simplified, fast-track Republican approach. So those who are trying to get their toehold, their foothold on the first or second rung of that economic ladder, they end up having to pay for more tax breaks for those at the top. And now today, through this resolution, we see that what Mitt Romney was a part of in exporting jobs abroad, he was really just getting started. Because what they propose is a territorial tax system. What is that? A territorial tax system is when you create jobs in somebody else's territory. Here's how it works. Here's the plan that they're talking about. You're a manufacturer and you're trying to decide, where will I create my new plant and locate it? I could locate it in San Antonio, Texas. I could locate it in Shanghai. Under their territorial plan, if you locate it in Shanghai, it's tax-free. Guess where the incentive is under their plan to create new jobs? It's not in Texas. It's not in America. It's someplace else. That's what the territorial tax system is all about. But of course, with all the loopholes that their lobbyists have been able to get through the decades, corporations aren't paying 35%. Many of our largest corporations like General Electric, they're not only paying less than the hardware store in Lockhart or in Austin that's selling their products, they're paying less than the cleaning crew that cleaned up the boardroom at General Electric pays in terms of a tax rate. Because they found all these loopholes, we have hundreds of large no-tax corporations that are paying next to nothing in terms of their taxes already. They would simply expand that with great inequity. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back, and the gentleman from Michigan reserves the balance of his time. What purpose does the gentleman from Michigan rise?
I yield myself 30 seconds, and I would just say that the gentleman from Texas just described current law, as long as you don't bring it back. So what we're looking for is really, we are on a crossroads. I agree with him on that. We really have a choice. Do we follow their path of a tax hike that costs us 700,000 jobs, or do you follow our path of a comprehensive tax reform that grows our economy and creates up to 1 million jobs? At this time, I will yield 2 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from Nebraska, member of the Ways and Means Committee, Mr. Smith. I also ask unanimous consent that the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Teaberry, be permitted to control the balance of my time.
Without objection, so ordered. Gentleman from Nebraska is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the gentleman for yielding. I rise today in support of the underlying bill, and I think that the American people expect us to have a debate here in Washington that is about better policy and not one-upsmanship and various 30-second sound bites. But we know that there are many barriers in our economy, barriers to moving our economy again, going forward. And we know that comprehensive tax reform is one of the most important issues we need to face. It isn't always the most popular issue, not always the most tangible issue, but we know, whether it's farmers or ranchers, incidentally from my district, small businesses everywhere, or anything relating to the economy, we know we have work to do. We know that our current tax code, as we have heard most recently, is very costly, confusing, and complicated. The current tax code is comprised of more than 10,000 pages of ever-changing laws and regulations. It's a patchwork of various credits, deductions, exemptions, tax hikes, and expiring provisions. This makes responsible business and financial planning next to impossible. The cost of compliance is obviously a burden. Compliance costs with the current tax code falls disproportionately on small businesses, which spend an average of $74 per hour on tax-related compliance, making it the most expensive paperwork burden they will encounter. Additionally, our onerous, excessive system is a system out of control spending addiction that has dominated Washington for far too long, under both parties, I would add. It is time for a system which lowers the rate, broadens the base, and addresses global competitiveness. The Ways and Means Committee has held a series of hearings soliciting input on tax reform, and we will continue in that direction toward fundamental tax reform. The bill before us today provides an important path forward to ensure Congress acts in a timely manner to reform this convoluted tax code, and it outlines a framework for comprehensive reform. I urge my colleagues to support the Pathway to Job Creation Act. I yield back the balance.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Ohio reserves the balance of his time. For what purpose does the gentleman from Michigan rise?
Ed, you ready? It is now my real pleasure to yield 4 minutes to a veteran of many battles on this floor, Mr. Markey of Massachusetts.
The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized for 4 minutes.
I thank the gentleman. As Americans watch their Olympic favorites this week, House Republicans are handing out gold medals to all their favorites right out here on the House floor. In London, speed, agility, and strength determines who gets the gold. But in the Republican-controlled House, it's the wealthiest Americans and the most profitable corporations who secure all of the gold medals. 2 weeks ago, Republicans awarded the gold to America's defense contractors by actually increasing defense spending. Despite sequestration, despite our ballooning deficit, despite the looming fiscal cliff, they increased defense spending. Then last week, oil companies scored a gold medal by securing new drilling rights off of America's coastline, off of our beaches in California, in New England, in Maryland, to drill. And the Republicans refused yet again. Even though Big Oil's margin of victory was enormous on that issue, the Republicans refused to end $4 billion in annual tax breaks to the oil companies we cannot afford, despite the fact that the oil companies made $137 billion in profits last year, the most profitable industry in the history of the planet. And today, it's millionaires and billionaires who will cross the finish line and secure the biggest gold medal of all, as the Republicans double down on the Bush tax cuts by rewriting the tax code to include $331,000 in additional tax cuts for the average millionaire in this country, a tax break they do not need and America cannot afford. House Republicans are setting a world record in rigging the tax system for the ultra-rich while cutting middle-class priorities like education and investing in good American jobs. The big losers in the Republican Olympics, the middle class, whose taxes will go up, the middle class where the Medicare guarantee for millions of seniors will ultimately be destroyed. The big losers, investment in finding cures for Alzheimer's and cancer and Parkinson's, which will have to be drastically cut so that the Republicans can crown billionaires, big oil, and nuclear bomb builders the big gold medal winners. The losers, the American people and their families, health and well-being. Vote no on this fixed Republican Olympics. Vote no to take care of the billionaires in our country as ordinary families suffer. Nostalgia for a past that never existed has overtaken the idealism which should animate our debates here on the House floor. For the poor, the sick, and the elderly, the past is just a memory, and the future is their hard reality. And this Republican budget makes that future all the more difficult for the middle class in our country. Vote no on this fixed Republican
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Michigan reserves the balance of his time. What purpose does the gentleman from Ohio rise?
I recognize the gentlelady from Kansas, Ms. Jenkins, for 2 minutes.
Gentlewoman from Kansas is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Tax reform may not be as exciting as watching Team USA win a gold medal, but for a CPA who specialized in tax, comprehensive tax reform is the Olympics, and we want to win a gold medal for the American taxpayers. Our tax code is a disaster. At around 15,000 pages, it's too long, it's too complicated, and it's chock full of loopholes favoring some taxpayers at the expense of others. Temporary tax provisions alone have increased from 14 in 1986 to 132 today. U.S. taxpayers and businesses spend 7.6 billion hours simply complying with the code. Tax compliance as an industry is one of the country's largest, requiring 3.8 million workers. That's just too much. We need a code that is more fair, equitable, and efficient. We need to broaden the base, lower rates, and ignore special interests who fight to block reform that will save us billions of dollars and create 1 million jobs. Our friends across the aisle believe increasing the top rate will restore fairness. But how can further complicating the code with more exclusions for certain folks while making it more complicated for others, how does that make it more fair? We have the means and the tools to reduce the tax rates here, and we need to get busy. Overhauling the entire tax code is the only way to restore fairness. And what we've learned from the 1986 reforms is that broadening the base, eliminating loopholes, and lowering the rates will grow the economy and raise revenues. This bill not only supports comprehensive tax reform, but it lays out a plan to ensure that it actually happens. Tax reform's a no-brainer. It's a win-win for the economy, our businesses, and our hardworking American families. I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields back. The gentleman from Ohio reserves the balance of his time. What purpose does the gentleman from Michigan rise?
It's now my real pleasure to yield 4 minutes to the ranking member of the Budget Committee, the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Van Hollen.
Gentleman from Maryland is recognized for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Mr. Levin, for all your good work here. Mr. Speaker, let's start with a point of agreement. We should simplify the tax code. We should reform the tax code. It's an overly complicated mess, and it needs to be streamlined and reformed. We could start with some really simple things, like getting rid of the special tax breaks and giveaways to big oil companies, but our Republican colleagues on this House floor had voted time and again against that. What we should not do is what we're hearing from a lot of our colleagues today, which is use the language of tax reform as a Trojan horse to provide another huge windfall to the wealthiest Americans at the expense of the rest of America. And yet that's exactly the direction that this bill takes us in. The main principle enshrined in this bill is the old Republican principle of trickle-down economics, the failed idea that we need to give more tax cuts to the folks at the very, very top, and somehow those benefits are going to trickle down to everybody else. The problem, Mr. Speaker, is the American people have seen this movie before. That's no longer a theoretical idea. We ran a real-world experiment on that idea. It was called the 8 years of the Bush administration. We had tax cuts that disproportionately benefited the very wealthy in 2001, 2003. At the end of those 8 years, what was the state of the economy? Net loss of private sector jobs, less than zero. The one number that did go up, it wasn't jobs, it was the deficit. That number went through the roof, and the rest of the country is left to pick up the tab. And that's what the American people are beginning to focus on, Mr. Speaker, that these tax cuts for the wealthy are not a free lunch for the rest of the country, but that they come at the expense of everyone and everything else. Because the math is pretty simple. If you refuse to ask the wealthiest Americans to pay 1 penny more for the purpose of deficit reduction, everybody else gets harder. Seniors on Medicare have to pay more, even though their median income is under $23,000. It means deep cuts to investments in our economy, in our kids' education, in science and research, and in infrastructure. Now, with today's bill, our Republican colleagues, as Mr. Levin said, are doubling down on an idea that we know does not work. They're providing another round of tax cuts to millionaires and directly asking middle-class taxpayers to pick up the tab. Let's do the math. Let's do the math. That's what we try and do in the Budget Committee. When you drop the top tax rate from 35% to 25%, first of all, you provide huge breaks to the folks at the very top, but that loses $4 trillion over 10 years. In other words, the deficit grows by $4 trillion. Now, our Republican colleagues say, oh, no, we don't want to do that. We really care about the deficit. We're going to make up those $4 trillion through tax reform. Of course, they won't tell us one thing about what they would do in tax reform, but the good news is the Tax Policy Center, an independent group here in Washington, has told us what the Romney plan would do, a plan very similar to this plan. And what they make clear is that when you start removing all those deductions and all the benefits, for example, for health plans or for mortgage interest deduction, what you end up doing is providing a big tax increase to middle-income taxpayers, financing tax breaks for the folks at the top by increasing the burden on. Mr. Chairman, if I could have another minute.
Minutes. Gentleman's recognized for 2 minutes.
That's the simple math of the situation. Now, I know that we heard from the Romney campaign that that's a liberal think tank. Well, here's what the Romney campaign spokesman said about an earlier analysis from the same Tax Policy Center when they liked the results. Then they called it an objective third-party analysis. Romney, spokesman of an earlier Tax Policy Center analysis. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is a group here in Washington that does good nonpartisan work. And that is the result that they found. And it makes common sense. You're trying to make up $4 or $5 trillion through tax reform. You're going to switch that burden. Now, we've also heard that this is somehow going to help make it in America, that this is going to incentivize companies to do more business here in America. The reality is just the opposite in this bill. You move to a pure territorial system, your slogan might as well be, make it overseas, offshore American jobs. And again, let's just look to the analysis done by another nonpartisan group. Mr. Levin's talked about the Joint Committee on Taxation Analysis. They've already said that if you move to a pure territorial system, and I quote, you will erode our domestic tax base and increase our deficits. Why will you erode our domestic tax base? Because more companies will shift their investments and operations overseas. That means more American jobs overseas. In fact, another nonpartisan study found that this particular proposal, Republican proposal, which Mr. Romney also supports, would create 800,000 jobs. The problem is they found it would create 100,000 jobs overseas, not here in America, by setting up companies in places like the Cayman Islands and Switzerland. So, Mr. Speaker, let me just say,
I yield an additional minute.
Mr. Speaker, let me just say, let us come up with a tax reform plan that works for all of the American people. Let's come up with a plan that will help grow our economy from the middle out, not this failed idea of trickle-down economics from the top down. And that is what this debate is all about, because what we want to do through tax reform is empower the middle class and empower small businessmen and women. You do not empower the middle class by creating a situation where by giving tax breaks to the wealthy, you increase the deficit for the rest of the country. Because when you increase the deficit, you're asking everybody else to pay for those breaks at the very top. And people will pay by fewer investments in education, fewer investments in science and research, fewer investments that are important to empower our economy, and everybody else will be left to pick up this deficit tab while folks at the very top get another break. Let's not do that.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Michigan reserves the balance of his time. What purpose does the gentleman from Ohio rise?
I yield myself 30 seconds.
Gentleman's recognized for 30 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The gentleman from Maryland is attacking two Republican plans that are not our plans. And the gentleman knows that, for instance, the proposed territorial system that we have proposed is not a pure territorial system, for instance. It has anti-abuse rules. And we can broaden the base by getting rid of deductions and credits without impacting middle-class taxpayers. I yield with that, Mr. Speaker, 2 minutes to the gentleman from Minnesota, the new acting chairman of the Income Security Subcommittee of the Ways and Means Committee, Mr. Paulson.
Gentleman from Minnesota is recognized for 2 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, that little word tax that we've been talking about today is really, in reality, 3.8 million words that make up the entire U.S. tax code. And over the past 10 years alone, Congress has found itself to make over 4,428 changes to the tax code, averaging about one change each and every single day. It's time, Mr. Speaker, that we find consensus and provide a simpler, fair, and more competitive tax code for everyone. Over the past 2 years, the Ways and Means Committee has held over 20 hearings laying the groundwork for comprehensive tax reform. We've had meetings jointly with the Senate as well. This legislation that we will vote on today now gives us a path forward that will allow small businesses and all American families the opportunity to have a simpler and fairer, more competitive tax code, not one that actually picks only winners and losers. We need to close loopholes. We need to eliminate and reduce the number of expenditures and deductions and exemptions that bestow preferential treatment for varying interest groups and primarily only benefit a few. Business leaders and economists across the country agree that in order to create more jobs, we've got to make sure that America stays globally competitive. But the complexity of the tax code has put America at a disadvantage. Back in 1960, 85% of all the top 20 world firms were in the United States. By 1985, there were only 13. By the year 2010, this number was cut in half again to a meager 6. Putting it simply, Mr. Speaker, the tax code's antiquated features have diminished the attractiveness for the United States to become the premier country in which to locate and found and start a business. This means fewer small businesses, it means less manufacturing, and it means fewer jobs. Today's votes show that we are serious about moving forward on tax reform to help get our economy back on track. Let's make the United States the #1 destination for entrepreneurs, for innovators, and for job creators. Let's put this motion in place to pass this measure. I yield back the measure of my time.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Ohio reserves the balance of his time. What purpose does the gentleman from Michigan
reserve?
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Ohio.
I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from North Dakota, a member of the Ways and Means Committee and a distinguished member of the Select Revenue Subcommittee, Mr. Byrd.
Thank you. Gentleman from North Dakota is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank the chairman for yielding. Madam Speaker, I rise to support this critical piece of legislation to stop the tax hike. We have a choice to make here. We can support job creators like small businessmen, farmers, and ranchers that have made North Dakota's economy so strong. Or we can abandon them and allow our nation to go over the so-called fiscal cliff. I have to remind my friends on the other side, this is something we talked about at a recent Ways and Means hearing. Small businesses are not the wealthy. They're not pocketing huge profits. They're trying to grow their businesses by reinvesting back into their business. That's what's creating jobs. And at a time like this, we need to create jobs. We can't afford the Democrat plan, which will increase taxes and decrease over 700,000 jobs. We need stability, we need certainty, and we need to pass this legislation so we can provide stability and certainty to our job creators until we complete comprehensive tax review. Thank you, and I yield back the remainder of my time.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The gentleman from Ohio reserves the balance of his time.
I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Ohio.
Mr. Speaker, can I ask how much time each side has remaining?
The gentleman from Ohio has 30.5 minutes, while the gentleman from Michigan has 9 minutes.
With that, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to yield 3 minutes to another distinguished member of the Ways and Means Committee and a member of the Select Revenue Subcommittee from New York, Mr. Reed.
Gentleman from New York is recognized
for 3 minutes.
3 minutes. Gentleman is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for yielding the time. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to stand in strong support of the proposed legislation before us this afternoon. The reason why is we have to stop with the rhetoric down here in Washington, D.C. Hardworking taxpayers across America demand
that we get this right and we get the business of the people done. We need to listen to our fellow Americans, that our tax code, that we both, on each side of this aisle, have argued for the last hour, have agreed is broken. It's time to set a path forward. I have a picture here, Mr. Speaker, that I would like to display to all of us in this chamber and across America. There's a clear path forward that we need to go down. And it is a path to go forward on a Republican plan that sets forth comprehensive tax reform in an open and honest fashion, and making sure that we get comprehensive tax reform done in the upcoming year, and do it in a way that brings the American people into the debate, and we listen to the American people. We no longer can pick winners and losers in our tax code. We need to focus on a tax code that is simple, that is fair, that is competitive. Because, like it or not, we live in a world economy upon which our hardworking Americans have to compete. And our tax code needs to be updated to make sure that we put our individuals and our corporations in the most competitive position possible, so that when they go out on the world economic stage, that they can compete and win, and we stand with them rather than engage in the bitter rhetoric and partisan divide that is on display, in my opinion, today. So, Mr. Speaker, with that, I ask support for the underlying legislation, and I ask my colleagues to join us and join hands and engage in a substantive, spirited debate, but at the end of the day, come up with a comprehensive tax reform package that is going to protect Americans and preserve America for generations to come. And with that, I yield back, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Ohio reserves the balance of his time. What purpose does the gentleman from Michigan
I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Ohio.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With that, I would like to yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Schock, a distinguished member of the Ways and Means Committee, for 3 minutes.
Gentleman from Illinois is recognized for 3 minutes.
Well, I thank the Speaker. Well, here we are, 20 months removed since December 2010, when we last had this debate. 20 months removed from when the President and 91 current House Democrat members, 39 sitting Democratic senators, 91 House Democrats, all agreed that our economy couldn't survive a new round of tax increases. 20 months since unemployment of 8.9% has continued, quarterly GDP growth of just 2.5%, and 20 months from a president who proclaimed it wasn't wise policy to raise taxes during a recession. Well, what has changed, Mr. Speaker? Not much. Unemployment is still over 8%, GDP growth has actually worsened to 1.5%, and politicians and presidents from both sides of the aisle are once again saying it is not wise economic policy to increase taxes. Yet one thing has changed. Earlier this summer, the President reversed his decision, decided our economy has undergone some sort of significant improvement, and called for a massive tax increase on American small businesses, a call which Senate Democrats responded to and which, according to independent analysis, would shrink our economy by 1.3%. The rhetoric used to advocate for increasing taxes by the other side is the same populist grandstanding we have been hearing for years. Everyone needs to pay their fair share. We need to increase taxes on those millionaires and billionaires. Only 3% of America's job creators will be affected. Well, the late Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan once famously said, "Everyone is entitled to his own opinion, but everyone is not entitled to their own facts." Just like before, none of the claims made by my friends on the other side of the aisle are supported by fact, but instead only by campaign commercials and their opinion. Here are the facts by independent analysis. According to the Independent Joint Committee on Taxation, 900,000 small businesses will be subject to these higher taxes. 53% of small business income would be hit by these tax increases. 710,000 fewer jobs in America if this tax increase is implemented. And investments many of which senior citizens lived on, dividend income will increase by as high as 40% with this tax increase. Simply put, there is no bigger pants-on-fire argument than that being put forward by our President proclaiming that these proposed tax increases would only affect 3% of our small businesses. Now look, the decision is very clear. We can vote no on both of the proposals, H.R. 8 and H.R. 6169, follow the President and the Senate Democrats towards a vision that will proven cost our economy jobs and growth, or we can alternatively vote yes on these two proposals, which will ensure that the Bush-Obama tax rates stay in effect for a year and we get the comprehensive tax reform we're looking for.
Gentleman's time is expired.
I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Ohio reserves the balance of his time. For what purpose does the gentleman from Michigan rise?
I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Without objection, the gentleman from Michigan will control the balance of the time.
Thank you.
So ordered.
At this time, I yield to the gentleman from Georgia for the purposes of a colloquy.
Thank the chairman for yielding, and I want to say to you, as I said to you in the Rules Committee yesterday, how much I appreciate your leadership on fundamental tax reform. I've been watching this body for 20 years, and I think some of the criticisms of my friends on the Democratic side were right on target. A lot of lip service has been paid to doing it, but the action has not happened. And what you have been able to accomplish in your committee in 18 months truly makes me believe that fundamental tax reform is now right around the corner for all Americans, and I'm grateful to you for your work there. I had two questions about this bill that's before us today, this expedited procedures bill. It does lay out a framework, but it seems to me to lay out a framework that is broad enough that we will have a robust discussion about how to bring and what to bring in terms of fundamental tax reform to the floor. Do you view this framework as one that is broad enough to have a full discussion of fundamental tax reform?
I do, Mr. Woodall. I envision with this framework an open debate, as I've said on the floor, one that will entertain a variety of proposals, and one that will include amendments so that we can move forward as a Congress on enacting comprehensive and bipartisan reform.
I know that, I think the chairman, and I know that in the Ways and Means Committee you will always have a robust debate. As you know, I'm a big fan of the fair tax proposal. I thank my colleagues on the Democratic side of the aisle for mentioning it earlier. I hope that made it out across the airwaves. But even if we can't all win in terms of our different ideas, America will win in the end as fundamental tax reform is passed, but lots of those competing ideas, even as only one idea can be certified within this framework to begin in your committee, you view, even after that introduction and that certification by the Joint Tax Committee, a full and robust discussion that would include ideas like consumption taxes in your committee?
Absolutely, there will be a full and robust discussion because, as I said, there will be amendments in committee. And there will be an opportunity for members to weigh in, and obviously this will be a national debate. So this is about getting us on that path, moving forward, because as we know, the alternative is, do we have taxes go up and cost us 700,000 jobs, or do we try to get on a path of reform that will create the million jobs that we need to get this country moving again? So absolutely.
I thank the chairman. I appreciated my colleagues' chart down there of that path of two futures. There's no question that our future is in good hands with the chairman on the Ways and Means Committee, and I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And at this time, I yield 2 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Hurt.
Gentleman from Virginia is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank you for your leadership on this issue. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of the House plan to stop this massive tax hike on the American people that is set to take place at the end of this year. The people of Central and South Side Virginia know that our economic outlook is bleak. Spending is on the increase, unemployment is high, high fuel prices have left lasting damage to our economy, and the government takeover of health care is raiding our pocketbooks at a time when we can least afford it. And now, Mr. Speaker, they want more. Now the President and the Senate say that they want to raise taxes and dig deeper into the pockets of the hardworking American people. I have said time and again that we have a spending problem in D.C. We don't have a we don't tax people enough problem. And this is now more clear than ever as our national debt ticks upward toward $16 trillion. Now is not the time to raise taxes on anyone. Will only lead to more job loss and more spending at a time when the American people are counting on us to get our economy back on track. And while we have addressed this tax issue in the House for today, it is equally pressing that we address the issue of our long-term prosperity. This country has long needed comprehensive tax reform. History has shown that temporary tax extensions will not fix the problem. They simply apply a Band-Aid. That is why the House plan has taken a thoughtful approach to stopping the impending tax hike and laying out our framework for reforming the tax code in a way that will make it simpler and fairer. The House plan also puts in place expedited procedures to ensure that Congress does its job once and for all and addresses the dire need for comprehensive tax reform. I was proud to support the legislation yesterday to stop the massive year-end tax hike, and I am proud to support this bill today to reform our tax code. It's the right thing to do for our country, and it's the right thing to do for our children and grandchildren. I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We just have one final speaker to close, so if the
gentleman reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from Michigan.
So, Mr. Kemp, we're ready to close. I yield myself the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
I can be very brief, in part because so many of us have come forth on the Democratic side with real conviction, with real passion, and not basically reading from prepared speeches that simply go over and over the same themes, but really talking about what's at stake for this country and why this proposal is worse than flawed. It's flagrant. I bring back this chart. No one has refuted it. It's based on the work of the Joint Economic Committee. Essentially, what this bill would do is to say to America, if you're very wealthy, you get a $331,000 tax cut. But for the typical family, it's a $4,500 tax increase. And so tax cuts for the very wealthy is essentially this Republican plan. Tax increases for the middle class, more and more deficits, jobs overseas instead of making it in America. This is the Republican plan, and essentially it's Governor Romney's plan. It's, as I said, worse than misguided. It would be a terrible mistake for this House to adopt it, and even a worse mistake for the American people to embrace it. I don't have confidence in the House Republicans. I have confidence that the American people will say no. Vote no here today. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose is the gentleman from Michigan rise?
At this time, I yield to a distinguished member of the Ways and Means Committee, the gentleman from Ohio, such time as he may consume.
Gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your leadership. You have done more to advance the cause for comprehensive tax reform and stopping tax increases on Americans than anyone in America, and we certainly appreciate your leadership. Mr. Speaker, the gentleman from Illinois reminded us that after the election in 2010, the President of the United States said, in this economy, we cannot let tax rates go up for any American because the economy was too weak. Well, today, ladies and gentlemen, the economy is weaker than it was in December of 2010. In fact, it's been weaker the last 4 months than it was, with little hope that it'll get better soon. Ladies and gentlemen, Americans are long overdue in having comprehensive tax reform. They want it. 9 out of 10 Americans now use a tax preparer. My father, a retired steelworker, my mother, a retired seamstress, use a tax preparer. And ironically, Mr. Speaker, my father came to America, my mother came to America for a better life. And when I got my first job at McDonald's when I was 16 years old, my dad said, "Son, we have a really crazy tax code that doesn't encourage you to save, that doesn't encourage you to invest. And you know what? You're going to save a little bit of that paycheck because it's the right thing to do, even though we have a crazy tax code." Well, my immigrant dad today thinks we have even a crazier tax code than we did back in the early 1980s. And it's time that we change that. The process in this bill will force people in this town to do what we haven't done for over 25 years, and that's fix the code. There's been talk on this floor about small business owners. I was a realtor. I had small business income. I didn't employ anybody. I'm proud of what I did. But there's a guy that I know, his name is RJ. He's a small business owner. He would be impacted tremendously, and so would his 50 employees if we allowed his taxes to go up on January 1st. Or William, a small retailer who hires people. He would see his taxes go up. Ladies and gentlemen, House Republicans believe that jobs are created not in Washington, D.C., but by entrepreneurs and risk takers throughout America. And there are two roads that we can choose to go down. And this chart couldn't be better in showing everybody out there those two roads. One road leads to danger. One road leads to a failing and falling economy with 700,000 jobs to be lost. We don't want to go down that road. We've seen too much misery already. No, Mr. Speaker, the road that we want to go down, being led by our chairman of our committee, is one to the right, now hiring in green, with 1 million new jobs, not created in Washington, but created by people like RJ and William, entrepreneurs, risk takers. And ladies and gentlemen, people like my dad, who came to America with nothing, who understand that hard work and risk-taking should be rewarded, not penalized. That's why today, the process that this bill puts in motion will lead us finally to say to the American people, yes, we've heard you, loud and clear. And we're going to simplify our tax code. We're going to simplify it for every American taxpayer so we can have an economy that creates jobs, doesn't pick winners and losers, and, ladies and gentlemen, gets us to a place where we have a tax code that people like my mom and dad don't have to go hire a tax preparer to do their taxes. With that, Mr. Speaker, I urge passage of this bill and yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Ohio yields back.
I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Michigan yields back the balance of his time. All time for debate on the bill has expired. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from New York seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute, printed in Part A of House Report Number 112-641, offered by Ms. Slaughter of New York.
Pursuant to House Resolution 747, the gentlewoman from New York, Ms. Slaughter, and a member opposed each will control 10 minutes. The chair will recognize the gentlewoman from New York.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentlewoman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, we all agree that the tax code needs to be updated and reformed. And my Democratic colleagues and I are ready to work in a bipartisan manner to accomplish that goal. But the flawed and entirely partisan priorities reflected in this majority's bill makes a very bad start. Their principles seem to point in one direction: less fairness and less of the burden shouldered by people who have the most. Fewer brackets, lower top rates, lower corporate taxes, less revenue, and higher deficits. My Democrat colleagues and I have a different vision for tax reform, a vision that is reflected in our alternative proposal today. My amendment would replace the principles found in the majority's bill with a different set of priorities for a fairer and simpler tax code, and I'd like to take a minute to outline these priorities. First, we must identify sources of revenue that, in combination with smart and targeting spending reductions, will provide the long-term means to reduce the national debt significantly, while making investments in national priorities such as infrastructure, education, research, and defense that are critical to the future of American competitiveness and job growth. I would note that nothing in the Republican bill says tax reform needs to lower the deficit or even to hold it level. On the contrary, there are indications that Republican tax reform would make the deficit worse. I think that they believe, along with Vice President Cheney, who memorably said, quote, "deficits don't matter," end quote. My Democrat colleagues and I disagree with that approach. Second, we believe that there should be a rate structure that distributes the tax burden in a more progressive manner. We support a tax code that discourages tax avoidance, including the use of entities as accounts in tax haven jurisdictions, such as Swiss bank accounts or assets hidden in Bermuda or the Cayman Islands, all done simply to avoid paying United States taxes. We believe in preserving and improving the provisions of the tax code that support middle-class home ownership, education, retirement savings, and health care. In addition, we agree the time has come to repeal the alternative minimum tax. And we want to retain and improve refundable tax credits that encourage work and education while lifting millions of Americans out of poverty. We support eliminating tax breaks for businesses that move jobs and profits overseas, in combination with reduction in tax rates for American manufacturers, which are vital to the innovation and job growth. In other words, reward the people who stay here. Finally, we want to preserve and improve the incentives for small business investment and growth. These businesses are the engine of job creation, and we must do all we can to support their success. Mr. Speaker, the Republican bill can be explained in one sentence. House Republicans want special procedures that allow them to force the right-wing legislative agenda through the Senate. Why are we wasting time to try to change the rules of the Senate, trying to force the other body to accept partisan Republican priorities rather than just sitting down together and working out the bipartisan path forward? This is a major question, I think, in this congressional term that, like others have said, is the poorest productive in history. Our amendment will remove the flawed, expedited procedures and misguided Republican principles and replace them with the principles that I have laid out. Let me end by expressing my utter disbelief at how difficult House Republicans are making it to pass the middle-class tax cuts right now. They've made clear they intend to hold the middle-class tax cuts hostage to tax cuts for the top 2% of Americans, though we agree that earnings of $250,000 and below should not see any tax increases. Yesterday I offered a simple amendment that would say we would delay our departure for August break until we got this proposal signed into law. It was defeated. Cutting taxes should not be that hard, and I hope my colleagues will join me to support my amendment and help in our effort to create a fair and simple tax code that works for all Americans. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman reserves. What purpose does the gentleman from California rise?
Mr. Speaker, I rise to claim time in opposition to the gentlewoman's amendment.
Gentleman's recognized for 10 minutes.